Hello, welcome back to our course on corruption. Today is week 3, lecture 3, and we're going to talk about indirect costs that flow from a firm or an individual engaging in corruption. Thomas, Schmerhorn, and Deinhardt have created a taxonomy of costs of this sort, not just for corruption, but for actions of firms and individuals in general. They divide these costs into 3 categories. The first is level 1 cost, the second is level 2 cost, the third is level 3 costs. And this is a pretty useful way of thinking about the kind of indirect costs that flow from corruption. Now, level 1 costs are costs that are assessed by a government or disciplining body or some established institution according to some very established set of rules. So, for example, a fine that's imposed on a firm for engaging in corruption, that would be considered a level 1 cost. And level 1 costs, of course, are the costs with which we are most comfortable, most familiar, what we know the most about. You will often see in business minutes, in memos that go between managers, references to level 1 costs. If we engage in this kind of behavior, we will accrue this sort of cost, right? They're easily predicted, easily measured. Level 2 costs are costs associated with the level 1 costs. So, for example, the cost of defense, right? Should there be a trial that is going to be levied to impose this fine? The costs of remediation, right? So the government finds that there's been a certain kind of misbehavior. What's the cost of fixing that misbehavior? The costs associated with investigation. There's been an allegation of corruption in a firm, perhaps in an office, in a country, on a different continent than the main office. What's the cost of investigating whether or not corruption occurred, and the cost of investigating what was the breakdown in management that led to that act of corruption occurring? Level 2 costs are predictable in a sense. We know that they're going to happen. They're not quite as predictable when we talk about what the amount of those costs will be. I can tell you with some degree of certainty the cost of defending, for example, the accusation that a person has violated a traffic law, because those kinds of defenses are going to be pretty similar in any given jurisdiction. But when we talk about something as complicated as a defense against an allegation of corruption, it's absolutely predictable that there will be defense costs involved, but it's not quite as predictable what those defense costs will be. And so, when we look at the minutes of business meetings or we look at memos that flow from manager to manager, we sometimes see reference to level 2 costs, but we don't see the same degree of certainty, and we don't see the same degree of caution regarding the fact that these costs will be imposed. Finally, level 3 costs. And level 3 costs are costs that are associated with the acts that led to level 1 and level 2 costs, but they're imposed from society at large. And they're imposed not really with reference to established rules, but more so with reference to established or even implied norms and understandings. And so a firm pays a bribe. That bribe is associated with a party that it turns out is associated with terrorism. Well, in some countries, where terrorism is understandably quite socially objected to, people might associate that firm with terrorism and sanction that firm, impose tremendous social costs on that firm. right? The reputation of that firm will be severely damaged. Again, it's worth paying attention to the source of these costs. Level 1 costs generally imposed by government or sometimes by some other form of disciplining or governing body. Level 2 costs flow from government or governing body sources, but also flow from society. Level 3 costs are imposed by society. Right? Level 1 costs, rule-oriented, easily predictable. Level 3 costs, norm-oriented, not very predictable. I mentioned at the beginning of our time together that I'm a professor of legal studies and business ethics, and this is where the two clearly come together. It's almost as if law flows into ethics. They really are one iteration of the same thing. Unfortunately, for businesses, the law side is well documented. Literally, thousands of cases in any given jurisdiction that provide guidance as to what these costs will be. The ethics side, again, there's not a good body of precedent that allows a business firm to make a prediction as to what those costs will be. Let's work through a very well-known example and parse out the costs to level 1, level 2, and level 3. Many people are familiar with Enron, which was a very large firm that dealt with many aspects of energy, particularly providing energy in ways that had recently been deregulated. Arthur Andersen was one of the largest accounting firms in the entire world. People called them the Big Four. They were one of the Big Four. And Arthur Andersen worked with Enron in auditing Enron's statements to the public, to shareholders, and to the government. When Arthur Andersen worked in the auditing of Enron's statements to these stakeholders, Arthur Andersen made decisions about what would be included in the audit reports and how those audit reports would be worded. Enron was perpetrating a number of fraudulent acts. Their fraudulent acts upon the government are easily characterized as corrupt. Arthur Andersen, therefore, in working with Enron to make these statements to various stakeholders, could be characterized as having acted corruptly. Now, you'll note that I'm very careful not to say that they were acting corruptly. And from a legal perspective, there is some dispute as to whether or not their acts technically fell within the criminal definition of corruption. That's the law side. From a social perspective, there's really no question. And a layman, a person who's not looking at this as a legal matter, but is simply looking at this, does this fall within our understanding of corruption, would say that Arthur Andersen acted corruptly. So we're going to parse what happened to Arthur Andersen in terms of level 1 costs, level 2 costs, and level 3 costs. Now recall that level 1 costs are the easiest to quantify and the easiest to predict. It's easy for us to say, well, if you do this, if you're caught, if you're prosecuted, you'll probably be fined this much. And in fact, Arthur Andersen was fined about $500,000 US. $500,000 US is a relatively significant amount to most people, but to one of the Big Four accounting firms at that time, it was, in relative terms, inconsequential. It was a fine that looked like it meant something, but it really wouldn't affect the operations of Arthur Andersen in anything other than a very trivial way. Level 2 costs can sort of be predicted, and we have a rough idea of what these costs will be, but they're not as easy to predict as level 1 costs, and they're certainly not as easy to quantify ab initio as level 1 costs. And in the case of Arthur Andersen, their remedial fees, their defense fees, their investigative fees amounted to several million US dollars. Now, several million US dollars is a much larger number than $500,000 US dollars. But again, to a firm the size of Arthur Andersen, it was relatively inconsequential. This was something that certainly didn't endanger the firm. However, we need to account for level 3 costs. Level 3 costs are very difficult to predict, very difficult to quantify, but they are real costs. And in the case of Arthur Andersen, an interesting thing happened. Arthur Andersen's reputation was damaged, and customers began to defect. In particular, the state of Texas, the state in which Enron was located, and the state that was therefore most damaged by the collapse of Enron, enacted a law that prohibited the use of Arthur Andersen for public services. That was a blow to Arthur Andersen, but a blow they probably could have recovered from. The state of California, however, followed the state of Texas, enacted a set of rules that prohibited the use of Arthur Andersen for any public services. And that was a blow from which Arthur Andersen could not recover. Arthur Andersen, soon after the creation of the California rules, dissolved. No one would have predicted, even 6 months before the end of Arthur Andersen, that their involvement in these particular acts would have resulted in literally the death of the firm. But it did. And that's one of the reasons we need to recognize the fact that there are level 3 costs, and when we're assessing indirect costs that are imposed on firms for engaging in corrupt acts or individuals who engage in corrupt, to understand that level 3 costs may be serious. They may be extraordinarily damaging. I want to return for just 1 second to those level 1 costs. The United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, at the time that I'm recording this, are probably the most active in terms of imposing level 1 costs. But level 1 costs are imposed all over the world. Nigeria, for example, a country that recognizes that it has a problem with corruption among its government officials, it collects several million dollars a year in fines imposed on firms, often firms from outside of Nigeria, that engage in corruption. The fines vary around the world from a few $100,000 to several billion dollars. Level 1 costs easily predictable, and they're out there. It's the level 3 costs that we want to really, really understand and be concerned with. Corruption and the revelation of corruption damages reputation. Reputation is something that in some senses can be quantified. Generally, about 1/3 of the value of a firm is intangible, and much of that is related to reputation. Reputation is something, though, that is inchoate. Warren Buffett, who in North America is one of the most respected investors, considers reputation to be far, far more valuable than actual revenue. And he considers reputation to be far more fragile than the material wealth of a firm. Clearly, reputation and the loss thereof is a potential level 3 cost always associated with acts of corruption by a firm or by an individual. Corruption also diminishes trust. It is a misunderstanding of corrupt relationships to think that a business firm buys trustworthiness from a government official when a firm pays a bribe to that government official. It's also a gross misunderstanding of how the general public will react to revelations of that bribery to think that it will not diminish trust. We know that people do not trust firms that pay bribes, and we suspect that people do not trust firms that engage in other forms of corruption. The relationship between trust and the general conduct of business is thoroughly documented and thoroughly explored. Pat Dowden, who is the president of the Center for Business Ethics, which has done extensive research on the relationship between trust and business, particularly in emerging economies, Central and Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, has found a very strong relationship between customer trust and business success, and a strong relationship between the loss of trust and a diminishment of the ability of a firm to do business. So when we talk about indirect costs, there are some that are quite predictable. Pay a bribe, you're going to pay a fine. But there are inchoate and unpredictable costs that are real and that are significant. And among those costs, corruption damages the reputation of a firm, and corruption diminishes the trust that stakeholders, including customers, will have in that firm. All of this can have a serious impact on the ability of that firm to conduct the business that it wishes to conduct. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lecture.